Good evening and welcome to Mechanics of the Fourth Wall. Joining myself and Antonio Subrats tonight is Jonathan, otherwise known as the Morgile. How you doing, John?
Hey man, I'm doing great. How y'all doing?
Not too
All good.
bad. Not too bad at all. How are you doing, Antonio?
I'm doing great too. All's good.
Superb. Well, in case you hadn't figured out by the slightly elusive title, we're going to be figuring out how we are convinced, or in the case of us three, were convinced that we lived on a spinning ball. Basically, the question I'm going to start off with is, how did they ever manage to fool us?
It was simple. They did it when we were 3, 4 years old. I mean, who are you to argue with adults who teach you everything you know, everything? Any arguments that you have as a 4-year-old or 5-year-old or 6-year-old, all of those arguments are squashed before you're really old enough to understand, the heliocentric theory fully and understand the problems with it and understand that there has been an ongoing debate about this topic for centuries. It's really easy because, once you've squashed all those questions that we have as rational thinkers, and never revisit that topic as an adult, then you just believe, I mean, I always go back to Santa Claus. If nobody ever told you he wasn't real, you'd still be looking for presents under the tree.
There's definitely a childlike joy in flat Earth. I mean, I kind of feel like a kid when I wake up each day. What discoveries will there be today? And maybe there's a bit of a pride thing amongst parents. I'm going to be a parent soon, but I just hope it doesn't come to that where if I have no idea what the answer is, I'll just fall back on some flat Earth model or, as it was in days gone by, a heliocentric model. But do you think that's maybe the case? A kid asks a better question or a better question than possibly an adult can even ask with their inquisitive minds. And the adult will just come up with the heliocentric explanation because that's the standard accepted norm.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have any children. I'm pretty sure if I did and they were old enough to understand it, I would teach them both models. I'd probably tell them to keep it to themselves at school. I would imagine I would probably homeschool at this point. But
sure. What about you, Antonio? What did you tell your kids? Did you tell them about heliocentric beliefs?
Yes.
Or
About the flat Earth and about they were telling me about what they've been learning at school, the heliocentric, and I said to them that it's a theory, it's an idea, and then I explained to them about the flat Earth, and they started bringing up questions saying, "Oh yes, because." The teacher was telling us about the phases of the moon, and I said to the teacher, but I can see that moon right now. And the teacher went to the window, looked, and wrapped up the lesson and moved on to something else. And then
deja vu. You had a similar thing back when you were in school in Spain, did you not?
Yes. The teacher was saying the sun comes out in the day and the moon comes out in night. And I said, sometimes the moon comes out in the day. And she said, no, it doesn't. And I said, yes, it does. So she said, out. And then that lunchtime, I'm just running around, I'm 10, and I see the moon. So I shout the teacher. The teacher happened to come out. She wasn't one of the people who would come out and patrol the kids, but she would come out and have a cigarette. It was okay in those days. And I said, Miss Josefina. And she looked at me, and I pointed to the sky, and she looked at the moon, and that was it. No further discussion. I want to pick a bone with you, though, John. You said that Santa's not real. I've seen Santa on television tracked by NORAD.
There you go. Yeah.
So, definitely real.
Yeah, it's got to be.
Did you have that in the States? We were told that it was Santa going by. Did you have the same ruse going on in America, telling the kids to look for the ISS?
I was never really that interested in looking for ISS for some reason. I grew up in Florida, so I did see a lot of shuttle launches and stuff. I have been to like Kennedy Space Center and all that, but in terms of the ISS, I never really followed it much. I mean, it just sort of gets boring because it's always the same old, same old. It's never anything new. And sort of going back to what we were saying a minute ago, even I remember growing up having a lot of, sort of questions about how does this work in the heliocentric model, and the teacher just basically not just totally over their head, ignore it and move on to something else. I think one thing was like, when they're teaching us about barometric pressure, and essentially it's that barometric pressure, a column of air, going up to the stratosphere, or the troposphere, or whatever. That's what renders your mass with weight on a scale, is all that air pressure. I think it's 14.7 pounds per square inch at sea level. And I was thinking, what about gravity? Because, shouldn't gravity also have something to do with your weight on a scale? And if that's what's given us our weight, if that's what's given us our pressure, then what's pushing at the other end? It's supposedly a vacuum. So that's what I was trying to ask my teacher. I'm like, how is this?
Surely that makes sense.
And it was just sort of explained away to me, and I was like, okay, no, I still don't get it, but okay, everyone knows the Earth is a spinning globe. So
when they literally stuck a vacuum on top of the ozone layer.
Yeah, I've seen the movie Spaceballs. I don't remember that part, but it's been years.
Yeah, they try and steal.
That's right.
The spaceship turns into a giant mega maid.
Yeah. That was like right towards the end. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It makes absolutely no sense. We've got a vacuum against it. You can't wrap your head around it, even if you try. It makes absolutely no sense.
But it's the same as the Big Bang. They say it starts at this point. And they have an explanation why it starts at that point, which is before that point there was no time by which to qualify the statement before. So there was no before. Well, that just sounds like any, excuse my French people, any bullshit explanation. It sounds like just because. Like, well, what do you mean just because? So the point at which this singularity created, everything came from this singularity, that singularity itself didn't have an original point, because it had to have a spontaneous existence, no millisecond before whilst it was forming, none of that, just boop, it's there and everything came out. It's bullshit, the Big Bang. Going back to
foundationalist beliefs that you have to start somewhere, and for them the Big Bang is that somewhere.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And the interesting thing is the powers that be don't work on the fundamentalist systems, foundationalist systems. They work by coherent systems. So they, when you have a multinational corporation, they will have fingers in many different pies. They don't work on the system that, this is good enough, we will build from here. They link their companies to all kinds of other companies. It's a coherent system. Now, if we did the same with knowledge, we would have a more coherent education system, but we don't. We have a foundationalist system for knowledge, which means we start at A and then comes B. There's no, we start at A because it's the shape of the mouth making the sound, because there's none of that. This is what people would later specialize in at university, but we don't have the general education taught in a coherent system or in a coherent form. So
not only that, we've got education being taught alongside science, and I think this is something we were talking about just before the show started, and the two don't jive. The two have absolutely no bearing on each other. You can't be totally insignificant, a speck of dust in a soup of dust, spinning away from another load of specks of dust and infinitely expanding. That doesn't work with anything that's spoken of in the Bible. So for that reason, I was getting kicked out of religious education classes all the time. And I know, John, you were sort of saying that makes no sense at all. The two don't work.
Yeah, well, I think that psychologically the heliocentric model is sort of frightening. And I'll be very honest. Especially for the last few years, I've just sort of had trouble sleeping, heart palpitations, night terrors, or like sort of like night terrors where I'll be like asleep but in awake and paralyzed. And when I sort of came over the fence over to flat Earth, all that just stopped. Literally, it was like it just stopped. It just doesn't happen anymore. And I think it has a lot to do with sort of the deeply rooted psychological idea that this world and everything on it, in it, whatever, is totally insignificant in the grand scheme of things. That's very psychologically depressing. But when you sort of look at it from this different perspective that happens to be the truth, it changes that totally. And I think a lot of people
couple that with the speeds that we're talking about are just ludicrous. The spinning and the whirling and the flying through space. It's just crazy.
We're talking of speeds. Rifling the static plane, the speed of the sun, traveling through space under the heliocentric model is much, much faster than the fastest rifle bullet. So when you think of a tracer bullet fired in the darkness of space, of nighttime, you have this stream of light, okay? If the sun was traveling up northwards, through space at its astronomical speed, it would have a long trail, and we don't see this. The sun that we see in the sky should be a ball on a column of light, and we don't have that.
Roll on the next NASA CGI with the sun with a great big trail.
Yeah.
I could just see it.
But also, sorry, John, but also the speed at which the sun travels has changed so much over the last 20 years. Just the last 20 years.
Has it?
7 or 8 times.
Huh. I think the figure now is something like 483,000 miles an hour or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's how fast they say the sun is traveling. Which is, it's just so ridiculous. And I actually dug a little bit. I mean, you sort of have to dig a little deeper into the heliocentric theory in order to really understand what we're up against. And so one of the things that I did recently confirm about the heliocentric theory, because I did sort of have the question in my mind, it was in terms of the solar plane, or the ecliptic. So in the heliocentric model, basically all of the planets go around the sun on the same plane, right? That's what they say, except for one planet. I want to say Venus is at sort of an angle to that ecliptic or solar plane. Now, I always sort of thought that the solar plane or the ecliptic was aligned with the galactic ecliptic, which is that path that the sun goes around at 250,000 miles an hour. But that's not what it is. And I also thought, okay, it's either the solar plane, the ecliptic, the path that our Earth goes around the sun, that plane, either it's in line with the galactic ecliptic, or maybe it's at a 90-degree angle to that. But it's neither. It's supposedly at a 60-degree angle. And so if you look at, it's sort of hard to explain, and I'll have to do a video with some more animations on it. But if you look at it in either scenario, so if you look at it with our solar ecliptic aligned with the galactic ecliptic, there's some major problems with that. And I've gone over that in detail. On the other hand, if it's at a 90-degree angle to the galactic ecliptic, there's major problems with that. But when you put it at a 60-degree angle, it carries with it both of those major sets of problems. And so it's like the more and more you look into the heliocentric model, because I wanted to know, I was like, well, which is it? What do they say it is? Do they say that, the solar plane or the solar ecliptic is aligned with the galactic ecliptic, or is it at a 90-degree angle? No, it's a 60-degree angle. So it's just bizarre to me, because it makes even less sense than if it were at a 0-degree angle or a 90-degree angle. Just very funny.
I think some of this lack of sense, like extra lack of sense, is just to bamboozle people. I really think there's no way that every single astronomer who has ever lived have all fully accepted what they've been taught and never arrived at any observation that jarred with what they've been taught. So at the point that an observation jars with what they've been taught, they would go to their colleagues, to their peers, and at that point just be kicked out of the astronomical circles, because you can't have the system being undermined. So at the point where you have the 60 degree, which inherits the problems of both the level and vertical, you know, at that point, people are just going to give up and leave it for the astrophysicists to figure out. They would just assume that the astrophysicists know. That's it. It's as simple as
well. And you know, the big problem I have is they love to use the phrase, you know, it's all relativity and it's all a fixed frame of reference, because I can agree, or I'll concede a fixed frame of reference if you're talking about, you know, a train going straight down a track, perfectly straight without hitting any bumps, going 50 miles an hour. Okay, so within that train, you can call that a fixed frame of reference. But, you know, if you take that train and it's spinning on an axis while tumbling end over end, it's no longer a fixed frame of reference unless you're firmly, you know, attached to that train. The same thing goes with the globe. I mean, you can say gravity and you can say relativity, but with all this motion going on, I mean, even from just like day to night, that's something that I've sort of animated recently, that you'd think that we could tell the difference between, say, you know, 6 a.m., the Earth is racing up towards your feet at 66,000 miles an hour, you know, coming straight up towards your feet, but 12 hours later, it's dropping straight down away from your feet at 66,000 miles an hour, and yet it doesn't seem any different whatsoever, you know, between that 12-hour period where you're phasing a total of about 132,000 miles an hour difference, because you're starting going this way at 66,000 miles an hour, and 12 hours later you're going this way at 66,000 miles an hour. So it's a difference in speed, or a difference in relative speed, according to you, of 132,000 miles an hour. It doesn't feel any different. It makes perfect sense, right?
Yes.
And if you guys, excuse me 1 second.
Yeah.
So we have to clarify at this point that it makes no sense at all. It is actually total nonsense.
Yeah. With the relativity argument, you know, a train traveling, say, hold on a second, why don't we include the extra elements that are being discussed? So the train is traveling and you're traveling relative to the train. Now let's take the roof of the train off and let's include a vacuum. Let's see what happens then. Because they just simply look at two elements divorced from the rest of the elements that are affecting the situation. So the very fact that the globe model says we have an atmosphere which is gaseous next to an all-powerful vacuum, an endless vacuum. This vacuum would suck everything away, but it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is that it's not true. It's just a story. You know, in the Lord of the Rings, Gandalf tells the fiery beast that he shall not pass because Gandalf is a servant of the secret fire. It doesn't mean that he is a servant of the secret fire or that the beast shall not pass. It's just a story. And what we have with the heliocentric model is just a story. That's what it is.
Yeah, it's a nice story for children.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I've just searched. I've just searched for the heliocentric system, and what you find is loads of stuff for kids. It's all cartoons. You know, it's basic stuff to brainwash them from a really early age. I mean, I know I've said this several times, but my niece, when I asked her where she lived, she told me she lived on a globe. And when I asked her why, it's because she's got a globe in her bedroom. And it's as simple as that. And if you think that this fairly complicated ESA video, which is probably, I don't know, I assume it's presented for 8 and 9-year-olds at a guess, is nothing compared to the non-stop programming that kids get on their advertising, on their TVs, in their songs. Everything that they're exposed to has constant heliocentric programming in it. I say this all the time, but we talk about things globally. We just do.
Yeah. Can you, Jonathan, Nathan, can you go back to the image of the Earth spinning around the sun?
Sure.
This is something that the Morgal has discussed in some of his videos, but it bears repeating. So let's see. Can you move it back? Okay. So when we get to the point that the Earth is going around the sun, so will you pause it at any point, Nathan? Okay, at this point, the moon is being pulled by the Earth's gravity for it to slingshot round to the front. But if you play it again and stop it when the moon is ahead of the Earth, at this point there, the Earth is pushing the moon. So when the Earth is when the moon is behind the Earth's relationship in terms of gravitation is a pulling relationship. When the moon goes around the front of the Earth in Earth's orbit, the Earth's relationship is a pushing relationship, because if it was pulling, then the moon would crash into the Earth. So this,
that's absolutely right.
Yeah, this is just a nonsense, and it really is just a story which, you can't really find out how often Gandalf clipped his toenails, because it's not written in the story. So when there are elements like this with the heliocentric model, you can't find out those details because they haven't been written. At the point that people ask the question, then in come the astrophysicists and the astronomers, and they fudge an answer. But if you keep on criticizing the answer or picking holes in it, they just bring extra elements. You just keep adding. Now, academics will say that this is just the advancement of knowledge. That's how knowledge is derived at. It's like, no, this is how fabrications are created. A charlatan will just continue to embellish the story. This is why the police will ask the same questions over and over and over to see any discrepancies. So there you go. We have here a simple discrepancy that isn't explained. They can't explain, and they don't explain, why the Earth goes from a pulling to a pushing motion. The whole falling around the Earth bit is nonsense.
It's hilarious because, see, that was, I spoke of one of the problems with the heliocentric model. If the solar plane or the ecliptic was aligned with the galactic equator, then the sun would basically crash into the Earth every year. Okay, but since it's at a 60-degree angle, it doesn't necessarily have that problem, but we still have the same problem with the Earth and the moon, because the moon, allegedly, supposedly, in the heliocentric model, is more or less on that same ecliptic, the solar plane. So it supposedly orbits the Earth on about that same plane. It's just like plus or minus 2.5 degrees, so it varies like 5 degrees or whatever. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Once a month, we should be racing directly towards the moon, with both of their gravities pulling towards each other. But no, we don't get that. We should literally crash into the moon once a month, but we don't. And then, of course, orbits seem real nice and make a lot of sense when you have everything stationary. It's a nice little circle. But if you actually go and animate, like I've done third and fourth generation satellites orbiting, and if you look at the animations, it's not circles. It's all these weird loop-de-loops where the signature represents this, like, say, third generation satellite like the moon, accelerating to speeds that are far beyond that of the host, which would be the Earth, then basically stopping and then slingshotting around the Earth and going far faster. That's the only way it would work in their model, but like you
It
said,
looks
it's
beautiful, though, doesn't it? When you see all those corkscrews and stuff. I'm sure I used it for the first ever trailer for Flat Earth UK 1, and it's just spectacular seeing it all corkscrewing around the black hole. It's just such nonsense. It's great.
Yeah.
but there's some big problems. Like, for example, one big thing is we should see the moon during the day for half of every month. Almost half of every month, the moon should only be visible during the day. And that sort of, goes hand in hand with the, uh, let's say it's summertime and you're at the equator and you look 90 degrees straight up over your head. You're looking off, say, way off that way into space. Well, 6 months later, if you're standing at that same spot on the equator and you look straight overhead, you're looking way off this way into space. And so we see all the same stars all year long. So there's no possible way that, this heliocentric thing works. I mean, it just totally doesn't work. Those are just a couple things.
Well, Antonio pointed out to me the hemispherical view that we get of our stars, and the giveaway being the Milky Way. Maybe, Antonio, you could explain that once again. It never gets old.
Well, it's just this. So you have the constellations visible from the Earth displayed as two semicircles, as two circles, two hemispheres. They have this crossover point. Now, the crossover point would be describing those visible clearly from the equator. But we're then led to believe that one is on top of the other. Now, if one is on top of the other and we're spinning, then we have exactly what you just talked about, John, which is the equivalent to being in a room and half of the year facing the window and the other half of the year facing away from the window. But we don't have that in the real world. In the real world, we have things moving and then things moving again. That's what happens. We don't have any point at which, for instance, from the UK, we can look, or from the US, you can look towards the center of the Milky Way. 6 months later, we should be able to look away from the center of the Milky Way, not outside of the Milky Way, away from the center. Gem Panda is in the chat, by the way, with his nonsense. He doesn't dare question any of this. Gem Panda, look at your window and then face the other way and tell me if that's what the world does. So this is what happens. So you have the Milky Way visible. There's no point at which we face away. It doesn't work. What we have contradicts the model. And that's because
While
the model
we're
is
on the
false.
subject, we might as well talk about other contradictions. You released a great TED Talk, or a section from a TED Talk, which talked about things that are supposed to be set in stone that are certainly not set in stone.
Yes. So Gem Panda just mentioned, he said that the moon and the earth are pulling each other along. Okay, so at one point the moon is pulling the earth is pulling the moon, and then the moon goes around the front and the moon pulls the earth. Well, sorry, it doesn't work like that, because if the moon was pulling the earth and the earth has more mass, what would happen is the earth would slow down the moon's pull, and the earth would slow down every month, and that doesn't happen. So the Newton's laws, they're not immutable, and what Rupert Sheldrake demonstrated in his banned TED Talks is that the constants like gravity, big G, the gravitational constant, is not constant. It has been demonstrated to fluctuate. Gem Panda, are you hearing? The gravitational constant, big G, is not constant, and neither is big C. The speed of light is not constant. So percolate on that.
But the TED Talk, in the TED Talk, he was talking about how the one of the professors he was explaining this problem to had explained to him that he had squared that circle, and he had managed to explain away that anomaly. Therefore, he was very chuffed with himself that he had managed to eradicate a very big fundamental problem.
Yeah, I would just say to anyone out there that's, I guess, trolling or whatever, basically what we were trying to tell you is that each season should have a unique set of stars, especially if you're talking about, if you're near the equator and stars that are 90 degrees, directly overhead from the equator. There should be unique stars from season to season. We don't have that. And so, I mean, it just totally debunks the heliocentric model in one fell swoop. And then you have the other observation where, if you think about it and you really actually model this out and animate this out, you should only see the moon for about half of each month during the day only. And that would be from its, almost, I guess, half moon phase to waxing to no moon, and then up to the almost to the new, or to the next half moon. Then you'd start seeing it at night again. But that's not what we see. I mean, some days you see the moon during the day, some days you don't, but it's not like every month for half of each month for, say, 2 weeks in a row is about what you would have to have if the heliocentric model were true. But that's not what we get. So, and when you have all these contradictions, and any physical experiments that you can do show that the Earth is stationary, totally stationary. I mean, where do you go to? I mean, so then you want to start talking about things like the southern stars. I mean, or where's the working model? To me, this sort of thing is irrelevant, because we've all been brought up on this heliocentric model. This is what's touted as fact. This is what's widely believed, and so technically, the burden of proof is on the proponents for the heliocentric model. Because
not only the burden of proof is on them, but they always seem to insist that we use heliocentric proof. So generally, you tend to look up when you're proving the globe and use celestial bodies and various other things they have a lot of assumptions about to prove we're on a spinning ball. And when you say it's flat, they still want to force you to look back up and say, well, how does this thing up there work? And you kind of want to shake your head and go, well, hang on, we're talking about flat Earth?
Yeah. The celestial bodies are a different thing altogether. They're a phenomenon on the flat Earth. What they are, how they function, the movements, things have been recorded for millennia. But what they are, they're certainly not stars billions of light years away.
Have you ever used an astrolabe?
I made one when I was at school in Spain, but I can't remember how we made it. It was all done stage by stage. It took us the morning. It didn't take that long. They had templates, but we had to cut them out and whatnot. I mean, we were 10 at the time, but
you know what it is. Could you explain? I've never made one, although I understood that children for a long time used to make astrolabes.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain what it is, Antonio?
It's a way of telling the time, basically. And telling where you are in respect to the stars. So once you know the time and once you know the stars, you know where you are. It's basically a navigational tool. That's what it is. It's for navigation.
And a surveying tool.
Huh? Yeah.
And a surveying tool.
Yeah.
But it works on. It's essentially a flat piece of machinery.
Yes. And the Ithacera clock. You're familiar with the Ithacera clock? It's a clock that measures the constellations. That was found is thousands of years old, and a company in the UK did all the X-rays and replicated it. It's got gears. It works by clockwork. It's thousands of years old, and it shows you the movement of the wandering stars, the constellations, everything mechanically. This was built before anybody out there. Look for the Ithacera clock.
But mechanically and 2D.
Yes, represents the heavens. But this was built before.
I think they found it like in the Mediterranean Sea or something. It was all barnacled up, and they did a bunch of CAT scans or X-rays or something on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I do know this. Yes.
Yeah. So this was This was invented back in the days when everybody knew that the world was flat. In fact, the measuring of the eclipses, all the things that we consider to be recent discoveries from astronomy are not recent discoveries. They're ancient, and they're written about back in the days of Plato. So these things are not new discoveries that we have because we have the heliocentric model and satellites and telescopes. These things were observed and predicted way before. In fact, the Mayans predicted them too. So it's just that the amount of lies that get thrown in to support the heliocentric model, like the snipers have to aim differently depending on the Coriolis effect that's likely to cause warping to the trajectory, that is just such nonsense.
Well, actually, okay, so I got the true skinny on that from a Marine Scout sniper, I want to say. It is in the handbook. They do have a formula for the Coriolis effect in the handbook for snipers. And the funny thing is it's not. It has nothing to do with the Earth spinning. It has to do with the projectile as it's a spinning object. A rifled round spins at high velocities as it travels. Now, say the rifle has a max range of 800 meters. Once it goes beyond that range, that's when that formula for the Coriolis effect is applied. But it's applied to the projectile as a spinning object, because once it goes beyond that 800 meters, it sort of acts like a gyroscope that the rifled round does as it goes to its range. But then once it gets past that 800 meters range, it sort of becomes unpredictable. However, when you apply this formula for the Coriolis effect, you can sort of predict that unpredictability of the spinning bullet. Okay, but if it doesn't have anything to do with the Earth spinning. If the Earth was spinning as they say they're doing, or as they say that it does, like say you're at the equator, you're spinning well beyond the speed of sound eastward, 1,037.5 miles an hour east, while basically since you're going, I guess that looks right, you're going around a curve, you're also vertically falling, I think it's 130 something miles an hour. It's like 700,000 feet an hour, zipping east. What is it? 1,037.5 miles an hour, right? And if you shot even like artillery or even a regular rifle, if you were on a spinning ball, you'd have to figure in all sorts of crazy calculations to hit anything, because if you study physics, and physics is literally the study of objects in motion. If you do any sort of physical test with, say you're on a merry-go-round and you throw a ball off of it, you know, that's nothing close to a rifle, right? But a rotational frame of reference, if you're fixed to the Earth as a rotating fixed frame of reference, once you shoot a rifled round off of that rotating surface, it's not going to stay fixed to that rotating frame of reference. It'll maintain some of its angular momentum perhaps, but you're going to have to figure in, you know, if you're shooting north, you'd have to figure, well, I better, you know, aim a little bit to the right, you know, aim a little bit to the east, because it's going to move 1,037.5 miles an hour that way to the east by the time my shot gets there. However, if you're facing west, well, that should be an easy shot, because when you shoot the bullet, he's going to start racing towards your bullet at 1,037.5 miles an hour. But that's not how snipers operate. Trust me, they don't do the Coriolis effect in terms of snipers is applied, but it's only applied to long-range shots, and it's the bullet as the spinning object in motion that equation is applied to.
So we've also got the Foucault pendulum, which is, again, a nice contradiction when you consider things like aeroplanes that have, no bearing. They're being dragged along with the atmosphere because the atmosphere is dragged along. But yet we have this Foucault pendulum which can show you the Earth spinning beneath it. In other words, it's isolated from this effect. Nice contradiction in terms from the heliocentric model yet again.
Yeah, but when eclipses, solar eclipses occur, these pendulums sometimes speed up or reverse their direction.
Reverse direction altogether, yeah.
Yeah, and I know when Foucault first did the test, he was like, "See, the Earth's spinning." They started trying to repeat the experiment all over, different latitudes and longitudes, and they got so many different readings that that everyone was so sure that the Earth was a sphere for some reason. I mean, it seems like even then, I don't know. Like, I'm trying to figure out because I honestly believe that the whole thing was a very long series of misunderstandings, logical misunderstandings, and at some point it became lies. And I'm not sure where that is. It's really hard to say because history is such a fickle thing. By the time Admiral Byrd went down to the Antarctic in 1955, I think at least at that point, they knew for sure. If there was any question, there was no question at that point. But before that, I don't know. I mean, it seems like people have assumed that the Earth was a sphere for hundreds of years. I believe Newton was, what do they call it, paid or promoted to write the Principia. So, it was just to see if the Earth was a spinning globe, how would that or could that work mathematically with orbits and that sort of thing. And that's all that was. It was, it's mathematically, I guess it's technically possible.
I think you're right, though. Certainly by the time we get to NASA, they know they're lying, and it's almost going by the current propaganda in our media, like a running joke amongst the elites. Certainly, it seems like they're laughing at us with some of the programming that's put into television. So it can only follow that they know this, but it's considered benign or irrelevant or not important enough to worry about, other than to laugh at us, laugh at the Joe Blogs public that just accepts the spinning ball heliocentric model as absolute fact, when, like I say, the elites, they know it's not.
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the pinnacle secrets. I really don't think that there are now, but 5 years ago, I don't see there being that many people in the know on this. A lot of people.
Even stronger. I mean, we talked about this before the show, and we said this is the pinnacle secret. And not only that, it's quite nice in a way. I don't want to bring this onto religion. I'm not trying to put a segue in here, but it's a spiritual feeling to know that. I don't know, how can I do this without not leading it onto religion? Before we started chatting about my interview with my uncle and saying that the only common ground we could find was significance. In other words, in the Bible, we're very, very important. We're wonderful as far as God is concerned. And in the heliocentric model, that makes no sense if we're a speck of dust and we're travelling on a speck of dust and so on and so forth. So the only common ground I could find with him, because he fully defended the heliocentric model, was that we are important. And in the world of flatness, you can easily translate that directly without any jumping through hoops. When you read the Bible, you don't have to explain away any anomalies if the world's flat, whereas everybody does. It doesn't seem to matter what denomination, what faith you are. You will completely buy into the heliocentric model and fight it to the death, with somebody who disagrees. And when you come across something that doesn't quite match with what you're reading in the most literal way, you'll explain it away or defend it. So in the case of my uncle, he was debating Richard Dawkins, and they got to the point where it was the Big Bang, and he was sort of saying, well, you've got to go further back. You scientists have got to go further back. And I kind of had to say, well, why you're buying into the heliocentric doctrine if you do that, rather than just saying, well, the Bible just says it's flat and God created it all at the beginning. You can have that. You can have your cake and eat it in that instance, but you're fighting him on his turf. When you say we have to go back beyond the Big Bang. Well, no, we don't. That's a foundationalist belief. That's their beginning point. It doesn't have to be anybody else's, including any religions.
Well, the way that I see it is it really is sort of, you can say, a satanic or a Luciferian practice to invert or do the opposite of everything of the
Yeah, the law of
creator of God.
reversal.
Yeah, the law of reversal. And so, the Earth being a spinning sphere is sort of it's contrary to a fixed immovable plane that the sun makes circuits around, right?
Do you know
So
much about? Is it Aleister Crowley? Do you know much about Aleister Crowley, Antonio?
A little bit. He was one of the
Right, you,
founders of
the,
NASA.
the wickedest man in the world. Yeah, he was high up in Freemasonry and in occultism. He was a ritual magician. More than likely, he wrote books where he wrote of things like the best type of people to sacrifice are little boys. You get the most energy out of it. So he's just an awful person.
Yes.
But he was also sort of intertwined with God, who is it? Hubbard
Hmm.
and the JPL guy, Jet Propulsion's Labs, Jack Parsons. And so there's this sort of connection between Satanism and Luciferianism or whatever and NASA from its origins. And then you add into that the whole, project or Operation Paperclip thing where they're bringing Nazi scientists in right after the war to work with us. And I think that it wasn't necessarily just because, Germans are good engineers, but they were also very good with propaganda. They were. And so I think a lot of what NASA was intended to be, especially after 1955, there was a lot of propaganda for space, space travel, space invaders, aliens, other planets, other galaxies. 1929, I believe, is when Hubble theorized other galaxies beyond our own. So you had all this stuff coming out, in the last 100 years, leading up to the 60s, where you have the Apollo missions, and it's like everybody was primed, programmed for this already, and they got away with it. I mean, they got away with it for so long. I'm really surprised that anyone ever figured it out and woke up to this, because it really goes so deep. It's almost impossible for someone to come to this conclusion on their own. It's almost like you have to be at least pointed towards this, or this has to be shoved in your face, or at least a seed has to be planted, because like we were discussing earlier, astronomers will notice things that don't make sense, and people will notice things that don't make sense in a heliocentric sort of world, but we just sort of blow it off, just forget about it, don't worry about it, doesn't make sense, whatever. And we've just done that our whole lives.
But it seems like when we actually study the programming, or with a conspiratorial hat in, start digging into these things, it does seem, I don't know how you phrase it, ass backwards, or I don't know how you use that phrase, but backwards. And that brings me back to Aleister Crowley and sort of laws of reversal, learning how to speak backwards and play records backwards and even walk backwards and all that sort of stuff. When you look at this stuff, even, again, back to my uncle, he published on Facebook a great long list of where the heliocentric and creationist beliefs are in absolute and total opposition to everything you read in the Bible, which does lend itself to satanic rituals and satanic behaviour.
Well, there's an interesting element that I want to mention now. With the Antarctica Treaty, you have all of these nations which are enemies, but somehow they're all friends when it comes to the Antarctica Treaty. They're side by side, they're not shooting each other up.
Yeah, it's all hands across the ocean.
Yeah, yes. During the Cold War, whilst the Cold War's going on, and everybody's thinking, oh, they're going to attack, or what's going to happen, behind closed doors, the elite were friends, okay? You can see this in Antarctica. So we have this idea that you have on the one side religion, and on the other, opposing it, science. But if you look back into the history of the Vatican, for instance, or Christianity in Europe, the sciences were inextricably linked to the church. The church ran the universities. The same in the UK. The church ran the universities. So all the scientific discoveries, everything that contradicted the Bible that was allowed out on purpose. And it's to help with the divide and conquer, with the confusion, the dumbfounding of the people. So you have evolution saying we came from electrified slime, and you have the church saying we came from divine inspiration, and you have these two opposing views. This is this duality that we live under. We're breaking this down. The flat earth is breaking it down. It's discovering, you have people communing with God before the Catholics demanded that people commune with God at church after living.
This was the very reason we started the show, was it not, Antonio? So we wanted to sort of explain that this paradigm, this false dichotomy, was complete nonsense, and it's just there to keep us in fear, to keep us under control. And a lot of the, I don't want to call them memes, but the show and tell that we're given in this regard, so especially when it comes to satanic rituals. We were talking about Black Rod with Martin the other day, and certainly with Bohemian Grove and all the stuff that we're very literally given, albeit in the alternative media. This is all just another part of the control of us. It's just another way of keeping us in fear. Would you guys both agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And one thing that I think is that the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican in particular, has done a lot to sort of, I don't know, discredit or, even apply like the law of reversal to Christianity. I think that the Roman Catholic Church, what they essentially have done over hundreds of years is they've basically just taken, the typical old mystery religions, the pagan mystery religions of ancient, Babylon and whatnot, and basically just parade around as Christian, which they totally aren't. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church is not Christian.
It's the most ludicrous thing ever. The richest church in the world after somebody who was poor. It doesn't. Yeah.
I think they had a lot to do with sort of religion helping to push this globe model, because if you can convince people that book 1, page 1 of the Bible is total bull, then you're scoring big points for the bad guys. And like we sort of talked before the show, if you're a devout Christian and you believe the Bible, but you also believe in the Big Bang and you believe in scientism or science as a worldview, then technically you're sort of in a perpetual state of cognitive dissonance, or you're almost, it's almost like you're confounded in your belief system, and that makes one particularly easy to control, because we don't have that balance. And I think that even if it's sad, because if you try to approach someone with this topic from a religious standpoint, even if it's a priest, it's not going to work. Okay. Now, if you approach someone with this topic from a scientific standpoint, then you might be able to get them to look into it. And there are certainly, a lot of personal affirmations, and I guess you could say proofs in the Bible to a priest. But this has to be presented to someone in such a way that first they understand that it is the truth, and then they can apply that knowledge to look at the Bible again. And again, I hate to use the King James version anymore at all, just because I've found several pretty blatant mistranslations, and I know a lot of people get mad for saying that, but I mean, it is what it is. go and, if you study the original Hebrew on a lot of the Bible, it's like for example, firmament. I mean, that's one I go to a lot, but firmament, everybody thinks of, glass dome, firmament, but the word that they used was just rock, which means expanse. So somewhere in that translation from ancient Hebrew to Latin to Greek to Latin to Old English to English, you get expanse to firmament. that's sort of a big that's sort of a leap. And so when you
my uncle, my dad did a play about Tyndale and the translations, and the thing that sort of came out, or the thing that struck me, was the embellishment of man. We will ham up the stories of the Bible when they're being taught in Sunday schools, and that ultimately, when you just do a direct translation, is what comes to light, how much embellishment there's actually been. But ultimately, I think he was burnt at the stake, or he was definitely classed as a heretic.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't mean to say that all of the King James Bible is wrong or it's a bad book, because I think that it is a decent enough book. But I just think that if we really want to dig deep and if you really want to try to find answers to things or spiritual, personal affirmations in the Bible, I just suggest to people to go to the original language, because I've done this in a lot of situations. And it's just, you find that what was originally intended in a biblical sense is totally not what you get in the King James Version. So I don't know. I don't mean to offend anybody with that, but there are a lot of bad translations. We mentioned the Antarctic Treaty as well, and how we had the Cold War with Russia, and I believe even North Korea a member of the Antarctic Treaty now? Like, all of these nations who seem to, be at odds with one another and mortal enemies, and yet everybody agrees for some reason that the Antarctic should be, left alone by corporations, especially. There should be essentially unlimited resources there, and we just leave it untapped. Even if it was a globe.
How's your petition coming along?
I haven't checked it in a while. The last time I checked, I had almost 400 or 500 signatures or e-signatures. So hell, if I can find it. I had to
as you're looking,
reset
can you
Firefox. So I lost all my bookmarks, but I'll find it.
It's the importance more than anything, as opposed to the petition. But the message was exceptional. So maybe if you can explain exactly what the point of the petition was, or the reasoning behind it, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, and I'll find a link to. But basically, according to Admiral Byrd, the Antarctic is rich in all sorts of natural materials. Think of petroleum, coal, natural gas. I think he even mentioned things like radioactive isotopes, like plutonium or something like that. Uranium. So I mean, it's basically from what he said, it was once tropical. Now it's covered in ice, so it could be a potential source of corporate activity for hundreds of years. He also mentioned that when he flew beyond the South Pole, he's the only person to have ever done so. He said that there was a continent, or there was a continent larger than the American continent beyond the South Pole, which doesn't make a lot of sense in a globe Earth scenario, but hey. So anyway, you'd expect that when the military comes back with, okay, the Antarctic is a pretty good place to start mining, especially when you see how close it is to the southern tip of South America. It's just a hop, skip, and a jump. That would be a perfect place for, offshore drilling, mining, yada, yada, yada. But no.
It's the Iron Republic.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think there's probably something to that, man. I really do. I don't know if that story.
I know they're just stories, but the Hyperborean and the Iron Republic, are they something that you've bought into? I mean, I've listened to 60% of the Audible version that you did, which is great.
Yeah. I like to think that it's possible. Um, I think who was it? Somebody did a really good. It was another sort of audiobook rendition of the guys. There was a father and son that went to the land beyond the north. So if you keep going north past 90 degrees, you have a hell of a time doing it. But then, it sort of warms up and things get sort of tropical and very nice, and the air's like sort of electrically charged. And apparently, according to J.E. Barrington, or whatever his name is, who wrote that series of articles in the 1902 Florida magazine, apparently went to this land beyond the South. So it's almost as if, the boundaries, to our world are superficial, just imaginary lines. Like, the boundary to our world is literally like, the Tropic of Capricorn. It's just an imaginary line. That's how far south the sun goes. But if you go beyond, this area somehow, there are other solar systems according to these, ancient legends, but also not so ancient stuff like the Iron Republic, and I forget the name of it was a father and son, a couple of Norsemen.
This was Flat Flat Earth, as his channel is now named.
Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly right. I was really fascinated with that story. I had actually almost finished doing the Iron Republic thing, but I set it aside. I backburnered it for a while, and I actually wasn't going to finish it until I saw that the one that Flat Earth did, and I was like, you know what, I might as well go ahead and complete it, and so I did, because now you've got two different accounts fairly recently within the last 100 years or so of people allegedly going to places that shouldn't technically exist if we live on a globe, right?
Sure,
so,
which ties us back into the beginning where we've got the Antarctic and Arctic treaties forbidding us from going to where, in these stories at least, you've got the Iron Republic in the south and the Hyperborean at the north.
Yeah.
And that's the reason for the globe. That's the reason for the globe is, we going back to the foundationalist system versus the coherent, we tend to think, why would they bring us the globe? And we think it's to separate us from God. Why are they doing chemtrails? Is to, Agenda 21. They don't work on the foundationalist system. They work by a coherent system. Just to explain, a coherent system is where lots of elements support each other, and part of the way they support each other is by being a representative. So if you remove one element, there's an imbalance that can then be redressed, but a wholly coherent system has all the elements interacting with each other. So when we think of why they brought us the globe, if we think just to separate us from God, just to hide God, it's an error. We're thinking the way they've taught us to think. The reason they brought us the globe is to hide God, to hide land, to control us, to cause fear. It's a myriad reasons, all of them working together. It's a coherent system that they're using against us, and they've made sure that we learn foundationalist systems, because then we're ill-equipped to look through things.
Because this contradicts what John has just said. So if we work on the assumption that at some point they've figured out that they've made a mistake and then started lying, that wouldn't really tie in with what you're saying, because in order to achieve what you're saying, they'd have to do it from day one.
Oh, I don't think that they realized that they'd made a mistake and then started lying. I think they realized, they knew it was a mistake from the beginning. We assume that, we're the most advanced that humans have ever been. We're not. We're not at all. We're like the fourth or fifth age of human kind of development. We have the ancient civilizations, the things that they had. In fact, the whole Genesis comes from Egypt. It was their telling of the Genesis. It was their explanation of how things came to be, and it wasn't from our contemporary history's Egyptians. It was from the ancient Egyptians. So they inherited that knowledge. And the things that they will have known, the Indians of India with the Virmanas, the things that these people will have known that have been buried and burnt and destroyed by the current civilization, we have no idea. But when things were etched in stone, like they were in Egypt, and then made their way into something that could not be destroyed, like religion, then we have these elements that have huge elements of truth. But to assume that it was just priests and scientists trying to figure out where we live and came up with this ball, that's an error. To think that they just arrived at this as a possibility and then ran with it and then tried to confirm it.
There's been a real bias in terms of just science as a belief system as opposed to a method of determining the truth. And that's been going on for quite a while, it seems, because most of the proofs of a globe, you have to assume that the Earth is a globe first. And people, it just gets so ridiculous that you'll have an observation like an apple falls from a tree, so the observation is what goes up must come down. Okay, so that's not debated. But so you have to come up with all this complex mathematics and gravity and dark matter and all this theoretical just nonsense in order to get that apple falling from a tree to work on a spinning sphere. I mean, that's pretty complicated stuff, I got to tell you.
See Brian Mullen for a full explanation and debunking of gravity versus density and buoyancy and potential energy and everything else that you can measure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but when that observation of what goes up must come down doesn't prove the spinning Earth. That's a lot of people. See, a lot of people have that all wrong. The observation what goes up must come down works in the flat Earth model, and even astrophysicists like Neil deGrasse Tyson will use what goes up must come down, which is an observation or even a demonstration of just this natural phenomenon, as proof of a theory to explain the observation or phenomenon. And this is across the board what they do with every single observation. The observation, you have to come up with some kind of theory to explain it, right? And then they take that observation as proof of their theory. And it to me, it's very frustrating. But what the globe is, I think, more than anything, is sort of an invisible fence. Because you guys mentioned a lot of things that it definitely is. But I think that it's definitely an invisible fence to where we don't bother wanting to know what's beyond. There is no beyond. It's just a bunch of ice and some penguins, and then then you're just going to come back around to the other side. So it's almost like they've put us in a hamster wheel. And really,
well, you say fence, I say jail cell.
Yeah, well, it's very much a psychological one, though. Sorry about it. This isn't my doing that.
It's a psychological jail cell. That's a very good way of putting it.
Yeah, it really is, and it's very frightening. I mean, and so to me, the whole thing, I think, give it 20 years, and there's going to be, hopefully we can get that stupid Antarctic Treaty abolished. That was ultimately the goal of the Antarctic Treaty. But, I've seen lots of oil spills. I've seen mountain ranges totally obliterated. They strip mine, and that's how they get coal anymore, because they've dug up all the coal. So now they just blow up the mountain entirely and just basically get all the rest of it. And they're doing this all over the place, not to mention fracking for natural gas, and then, getting rid of the, tropical rainforests in South America, which is the lungs of the earth. So they're doing all this stuff to basically, I believe, ultimately the goal is to put the earth in a position to where it can no longer maintain this balance. That's what I think that the ultimate goal is. I mean, that's why we're on fossil fuels still, I think. Is, that's why we're deforesting at such a rate. I mean, the rates are ridiculous. I really do think that there is some sort of an insidious plan to cripple the world's natural ability to maintain its own balance. I mean, that could be what they're doing with CERN and HARP and that sort of thing. And I'm sort of wearing my tinfoil hat here.
Well, no, it ties in nicely with what we've just talked about for the last hour, which is the same thing, but in a mental way. So disturbing our own equilibrium is the purpose of the globe as we've described it so far. But then you think about the actual physical, the things they're actually doing, and it is quite scary when you describe it in those terms. Is there actually a nefarious agenda? I don't know. I mean, obviously, like you say, you put your tinfoil hat on. You've got to speculate when you consider these things. They are actually happening. Let's face it.
Well, there literally is Agenda 21. That is something that the depopulation program is something that is a bona fide completely. It's public. You can download it from the United Nations. There is definitely a plan to do things. When we look at the situation we have, it's easy to see this matches this area of the plan. The migration of people matches this other area of the plan. So there are lots of elements that do match their plan. And I completely agree with you, John. We could be having gas from water. We don't need fracking. We could have timber, everything that's made from timber, made from hemp. In fact, we could have most things made from cotton, made from hemp. There's lots of solutions out there. What I think we're seeing right now is the death throes of the New World Order or the Illuminati. And when a creature is dying, it will have sometimes it will have these response actions as it tries to carry on moving. But the system isn't going to go away overnight, and it's not going to go away by just surreptitiously changing. It will go away in big chunks. So now we have fracking. Eventually, fracking will be stopped, and lots of lawsuits will be issued for the fracking companies, who will obviously close up shop and pass the blame on to somebody else. Things will improve. They always have improved. This is another thing. We keep noticing all the negative stuff in the world because we're engaged with media that tells us things are negative. For instance, just knowing about Agenda 21 is pretty negative. And even if we don't engage with mainstream media, we're still affected by it because in our circles, people do engage with it and bring elements to us. So,
but are you saying, Antonio, that while we're tossing our sleeping pills over our shoulders and sleeping easy because we're not spinning and whirling, the heliocentric believers are quite literally an animal in a corner and could potentially lash out in their death falls, or however you described it?
What I'm saying is they are lashing out. The savage things, the barbarian things that are going on right now. If we look in terms of warfare alone, we look at the First and the Second World War, and then we look at the Gulf War, and we look at the war in Syria now. The number of population of civilians dead is becoming much, much smaller. It's still horrible that a single person dies, but the per capita population is massively reduced. At the same time, we have the slave factories in China with all these people and the suicide nets. We have all kinds of elements that are brought to us basically to keep us unbalanced. If you keep
Could that not be propaganda as well? I mean, I've been to China and I
Yes.
certainly didn't see any of those elements in the places I went, although they were nice places. But could that just be propaganda for us when we're holding our Chinese-made iPhones? That image, that propaganda will be in the back of your mind somewhere. So there's going to be an inherent sense of guilt for your hard-earned possession. Do you not think that's just another level of programming? I'm just speculating.
Yeah, it's everything that we engage with is a level of programming from one point of view or another. If you want to look at it from an organic sense, you're programmed to receive certain responses from touch or smell or sight. And then there's the more overt programming, like propaganda, like you're saying, or advertising, or news items, food prices, conversations that people have that you overhear, that you're not intentionally, eavesdropping on. These are all things that inform us, that program us. So if you hear that somebody went missing, a child went missing, you're at your local shop, you hear about a child going missing, you didn't choose to hear that. It could be true, it could be false, but you're going to assume a child really did go missing, and it's going to affect your outlook. So, it's a case of what you choose to look at. When you look at what you were mentioning, John, excuse me, about the corruption of the scientific principles, we have the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the number of scientists who demanded that their names be struck from the report because they said that reports had been altered, where it would say there is no change. They would have the word no deleted, removed. So it says there is change. It's, in the world of science, we have to remember, in the world of commerce, in the world of money making, there's always going to be elements that are going to make sure that they have the bread buttered on the right side. And with scientists finding something that would scupper their plans for tenure or for the next grant, they're going to fudge data, and they have done. They've done so all along. They've done this with reports in history. They've done this with current reports. This is just something, this is how our society works right now. The interesting thing with the Antarctica Treaty is that no corporations are allowed to go. But as the Freeman movement says, we, all individuals, have been named corporations. So we're not allowed to go, It's all a big,
interesting.
It's a big mess. But there's, you can take a break from it. Like Bill Hicks said, you watch the news, rape, murder, pit bull, AIDS, over and over and over. You open your window and there's birds singing, and butterflies flying. The real world is something that brings peace. All of the mental constructs that come from external sources, that's where the trouble comes, when those external sources are not simply nature itself. Wow, that was a bit of a sermon.
that is a wonderful thing we experience quite frequently, you and I, Antonio, because we're insomniacs and we're often up till God knows what time in the morning, and the sun will come up and you'll hear the birds chirping, and it does bring such a big smile to your face. It's crazy because you should be exhausted and why am I up till this hour, but it's never like that, is it? It's just never like that. We're always really pleased to get to that point, even though we are genuinely tired. But I don't know, flat earth, you say it took the sleeping pills. Yeah, maybe it's just because we're realising how much of life there is to experience and experiencing every second of it, soaking up as much of it as we possibly can.
Yeah. Hey, John, listen to this. A while ago, Nathan and I were chatting on Skype, and it comes to dawn, and we were chatting with David and Patricia as well, I think, and it comes to dawn. I can see Nathan's camera was oriented so you could see his window, and I can see it's dawn, and I see out of my window it's still pitch black. It took about 40 minutes for my sky to be as light blue as Nathan's was 40 minutes earlier, and we're only 100 miles away. That was really crazy. That was a really crazy observation.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably too soon to draw conclusions, but we can speculate, can't we, Antonio, in terms of what that meant, because we did it several times, didn't we? Afterwards, we said, we can't draw any conclusions, let's wait till we do it a few times. We even did it once live, so it happened at the end of one Patricia's hangout, it was last week, and I just stuck the camera out the window to show that it was dawn, and at the exact moment you're there in total darkness.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the issues that we have is, we base our maps on latitude and longitude lines, which are fairly well measured and documented in the Northern Hemisphere. Most of I think it's like 90% of the people at least in the civilized world that are census or whatever, consensus, live in the northern hemisphere, and there's been a lot of documentation, observation, measurements done in terms of latitude longitude coordinates in the northern hemisphere. Now, in the southern hemisphere, that's a horse of a different color, where a lot of it, most of it, is just assumed to be sort of the mirror image, the equal and opposite of the north. And so that's why when you read accounts of far south polar excursions, captains would always find themselves 20, 30 miles abroad of where they thought they were supposed to be, because I just think that the maps, we've got issues with them because of the way that light from the sun behaves. That's what I ultimately think. And we assume that a meridian line is a straight line going from north straight to south. But what if it's not a straight line? What if it's a curved line? Then our whole map would have that curved line as a straight line. I mean, does that make sense? So maybe
Yeah.
I mean, of course, the map will work for driving. I mean, the driving distances are fine, but to me, it's just so bizarre, because especially like when you start studying things like high altitude weather balloon footage, the moon just looks so dim and tiny, and the sun just always appears so close to the horizon. There's just all these different things, and it's like, how did we all miss that? How did everybody miss this forever? To me, it's really amazing that people have woken up to this. Honestly, that's how deep the
don't you get, John? Don't you get a sense of hope, thinking, okay, so we've realised this. There will be people who haven't been born yet who will work on the back of some of the things that we're realising, and they will grow on a flat Earth, and they will have questions and ways of inquiring the natural world that we've been robbed of because we grew up on a globe. But I get a sense of hope, I do. I think generations to come will have some really brilliant ideas.
Well, Mercator, I want to say around the 1500s, something like that. It was when Gerardus Mercator lived. And he was making globes, but he was also making AE maps with, Mount Meru in the middle. And so I'm sort of starting to think that, people say, oh, we've known it was a globe for 500 years. I think that people sort of were open-minded about it. I think it was debated. I don't think it was ridiculed. I think that there was a time, like when Mercator was doing his thing, that it was like, maybe it's a globe, maybe it's flat. Let's try to figure it out. Columbus, in the, whenever he did his sailing, he disagreed with the what is it? Archimedes' value. He disagreed with the circumference of the Earth. He thought it was a lot shorter round than it was going to be, and that's how he accidentally discovered America. And so one thing I like to point out is that while locally Columbus's maps worked, during his time on a local level, the maps worked, right? But they were missing all of the American continents. So just because a map works does not necessarily mean that it's an accurate representation of the face of the Earth. And so I'm sort of thinking, and even if you look for some of the older Mercator projections, they've got this like, so say here's the southern tip of South America. It's basically butting up with Antarctica here. But then over here you've got this huge, basically, peninsula coming halfway up South America from Antarctica. So like I'm sitting here thinking, is there possibly an entire continent that we're just not aware of? Or something, there's just something up. I don't know. But look at some of those old Mercator projections, and you'll see what I'm saying. It's like there's some crazy stuff going on there, and it's like, how could he have possibly known all of these locations? I mean, it just sort of defies belief, but we still basically use the same maps that he created in the 1500s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Crazy.
found a
I mean,
map
with the
today.
projections he did that were flat Earth projections, were they something that he did in private, or was it all published work? Because I mean, you say maybe people reconsidered it either way or considered it either way, but the church would have been saying no way. The churches were teaching globe, therefore, you were a heretic if you didn't buy into what the church told you.
Okay, well, yeah, and maybe I'm off, because I was sort of under the assumption that Mercator, he literally like made globes, but also you can find, I'm sure you guys have seen the one where he's got the sort of the four rivers coming to the mountain in the middle, and then all the tops of the continents. So I don't know. I mean, the church was pretty ruthless, so maybe secretly he was a crypto flat earther. Maybe that's how they
possibly.
had to do it.
I mean, this is something we discussed last night, that maybe when we're finding things like the Japanese map and the AE map and some of the other Mercator projections, that people knew and wanted to get this information out, so they're doing it in a kind of coded way. But ultimately speaking, the maps are going to be commissioned as globe projections. So no matter which way you dice it, they're always going to be, if they're left there to be found as flat Earth maps, they've been created in such a way that they're going to lead to ridicule, like the AE map has.
Yeah, I think that we need to do a lot of observation and surveying of the southern regions, and that includes out in the middle of the ocean, because I want to know what the sun is doing, 24 hours a day. And there's times where the sun is not visible to anyone. It's over, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean somewhere, or it's in the middle of the ocean on the other end of the world at times. And so, we just don't have observations of what the sun is doing from every vantage point 24 hours a day. And so, I don't know, I just think that a lot more needs to be done in terms of measurement in the south, so we can get a better maps. But
this is something we can strive to achieve. Sorry, you go ahead, Antonio.
I was going to say, I think this links to the free energy thing, the question of free energy. If they have the free energy devices that can fly, or can cause flight, excuse me, it wouldn't be very long before you had people, flight aficionados, who would basically fly around. Now, all it takes is for somebody to have a device that can fly at 1,000 miles an hour, to fly in time with the sun, and there you go. There's the Earth mapped. And at that point, how do they stop people going beyond Antarctica? They're not going to set up a whole series of anti-aircraft artillery in Antarctica. So
but can we not achieve this more simply with communications? I mean, we can go a lot faster than that with communication. I mean, we're currently in 2 different days on this very phone call.
Yeah, but what I'm thinking is, if the minute somebody has a device that can do the circuit of the equator in 24 hours, it can do it at the same speed as the sun. And at that point, if we have information relaying imagery to computers worldwide, we'd see exactly where everything is. So I'm just saying, I mean, this is tinfoil hat, that this could also be another reason for suppressing the free energy. Not just the Rockefellers want to keep control of the oil, but they want to keep control of the information. And once people have devices that give them freedom to roam, then they've lost control. In fact, roaming is one of the things that's the most indisputably controlled. You try going to another country without a passport, and you won't get there. So our ability to roam, we're a species on this plane that's completely native to it. This is our home, and we have the ability and the right to roam wherever we will. But there's all kinds of laws superimposed on our natural abilities that curtail our freedoms. And I think once free energy devices actually come out, which they will do, if you think in terms of thousands of years ahead, in the future, Of course, it will come out at some point. They haven't figured out how to get there, but there's no chance that this is that the Luciferians are going to manage to kill the sustainability element of this plane. And
well, they're
just,
certainly taxing
get rid
solar
of
energy.
everybody.
So if you buy solar panels, you're taxed in the UK at least. I don't know about in other countries, but there's a taxation on them.
Yeah, but then this is just driving people to going off the grid. Eventually, the human spirit is a lot more capable than we're given credit for, or than it's given credit for, which is why it's so heavily suppressed. The information, the education, the media, everything is to make us lose track of our innate ability. We have the ability to dream, to conceptualize, to invent, to wonder, to cause problems. We have the ability to do all kinds of stuff, but we're continuously distracted so that we don't really, feel comfortable in our abilities. And this is one of the elements of the flat earth that the globalists don't like, that we're saying, dude, I've got a question for Mr. Scientist that Mr. Scientist can't answer, and they resent this. They assume that we have big egos, or that we think that we're superior to other people. It's like, no, children have questions that adults can't answer.
I was just about to say, that ties in nicely to the beginning of this conversation, because we said at the beginning, we've had this from our own personal experience, that we're told to get out when we start to be inquisitive in a class, because ultimately you're being taught how to parrot information. You're not being taught how to inquire or have an inquisitive mind. You're just being told, this is the information, regurgitate it on this test and you will pass. If you can regurgitate it well, you'll pass with honours.
In fact, just there, the word "you will pass." To pass means to go from one place to another. That's what the word pass means. A pass is an avenue, a path that takes you from one side of a mountain to another. That's what a pass is. And the word pass means go, proceed. So we have this.
But we have to pass along their path.
You will pass. Yeah.
Yeah, but we have to pass on their path. So the path has already been forged, and all of the details about the path are already set in stone. We know exactly what the path is. But my question is, in reality, may we reach a point where we realise that not only do we have all these questions, so do the powers that should not be, and actually the reason for the lie is that they haven't got the slightest clue how any of it works.
Yes. Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I have hope is I watched the documentary, The 1%, where you have the children of the most influential people in the world who are deciding that they want nothing. Yes. But there's also the guy from Thrive. Thrive, the film. He's from the Procter & Gamble kind of pharmaceutical plastics empire, and he wants nothing to do with it. So when more people get to the point, more people that have the ability to connect with prime movers, when those prime movers themselves say, no, I'm not following orders, this is not right, which seems to be what's going to happen with the consciousness that we're all experiencing. None of us actually said, I want to wake up tomorrow and find out that the earth is flat. We had a type of consciousness that was that had the flat earth available to it. There are other people out there, and then there are the people who are still under the spell of the globe. But within the people that are kind of more spiritually conscious, there will be people within the elites who are spiritually conscious and not satanic. Now, when I say the word satanic, I don't specifically mean in a religious sense. I mean in the term of the language, like you said, John. The word Satan literally means enemy. And you can see it as enemy of humanity, or enemy of truth, or enemy of health. So that's what I mean by people within the elite who will be good people. It's inevitable. It will happen. It's part of what's being controlled. And eventually that control will give.
Well, I think the big secret is the world itself is a big natural free energy device, essentially. That's, to me, that's the real big secret. We don't have. I don't think this world was designed so that we have to work and toil and slave away in order to be, productive or to be productive as a society. I think that our technologies should be used to, better everyone's lives. And indeed, that's what technologies are intended for. For example, like a corporation wasn't necessarily supposed to be an evil thing originally. It was supposed to be a public good, but they've turned it upside down to where now corporations are sort of running and buying the governments. But it used to be that a corporation, they were chartered to fulfill some public good, whether it was provide electric services or build bridges or whatever the case may be. But now it's totally turned on its head, where it's all based on profit. It's all based on constant annual growth. And when you apply that sort of ultra capitalist thought process to everything, be it medicine, be it criminal justice, you wind up with a jacked up society, which is what we have. But I think that all of these things are sort of hinging or contingent upon the whole globe Earth theory. I really do, because it creates this artificial scarcity. It sort of isolates us from everything else, and they've done a brilliant job. You got to hand it to them for that. But now, I still remain optimistic, because there's people out there waking up to it every day. So maybe we'll see it. I think 2016 is going to be an interesting year.
You said about being optimistic, and again, before we started the show, we were talking about your high degree of optimism, which you have. I would hope, or I'm going to maybe put words in your mouth a little bit here, but as a result of finding out we're not spinning, now I can say as a result of flat Earth and put it in quotation marks, but I like to take that literally. We do live on a flat, static plane, and knowing that fact to me is very grounding. I hope you both agree with me. That's the way it feels to me.
Yes.
Yeah, it really is.
I'm trying to lead this conversation onto some positive things, because we've talked about the negative energy of the control system that the globe puts upon us all, and how it's indoctrinated into us from children, and people being held as heretics and burnt at the stake for translating the Bible. We've talked about some pretty negative stuff, so I'm hoping to move it on to something a little bit more uplifting. And I find flat Earth very uplifting. And if we want to keep it on the topic of heliocentrism, I don't know if that's the right word, but if we want to keep it on that topic, the ludicrous nature of it is, to me, quite funny. I like the globe because it makes me laugh. Looking at the nonsense does kind of crack me up when it's examined. Or if you're looking at it in some sort of detail, if you're looking at a Brian Mullen video, you've got to kind of go, wow, isn't it clever how they've managed to talk away what goes up must come down, and give you this nonsense that makes you stick to a spinning ball. That's quite clever, but you've got to chuckle when you see it, because it is just nonsense at the end of the day, and nonsense is always good fun.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. All these experiments that supposedly prove gravity and prove the globe, like like the old Cavendish experiment, and good old Foucault's pendulum, and Columbus's observations of the mass of ships. All these things, they're presented to us as exclusive proof that the world is a spinning globe, and we never argue with it. We never second guess it, and we just, even the brilliant theoretical physicists of the world never revisit the topic logically. And so really, especially can't even say the word, theoretical astrophysicists, they're literally in la-la land, looking up at the stars, thinking that these are other galaxies and other worlds, when really they're just lights in the sky. It is pretty funny. I do get a pretty good chuckle out of it, and it really, when like Tyson drops his microphone, or when people say, well, I dropped a brick on my foot, so there, that proves we live on a spinning globe. I do chuckle to myself because it is fairly preposterous.
When it comes to the programming, when they show you globes in every cartoon, you've got to kind of laugh along and go, well, nice to be in on the joke.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I like to think of, back in the day, somebody sitting, on a prairie with a girlfriend. Wow, look at these huge trees, so still. Everything's so still. We must definitely be spinning at 1,000 miles an hour. There's just no chance. So it's got to be just a mental construct that then kind of superimposes a view, and then you have confirmation bias. So the globalists really do think that they're spinning. They look at the motion of the stars and the sun, and they compensate. They don't look at the lack of daylight moons. So like you were saying before, from the half moon towards the new moon, all of those should be in daytime, and they never kind of put two and two together that way. And when you point it out to them, then you have to argue against cognitive dissonance, and you can't argue against cognitive dissonance. It's like arguing with a dog. It's not going to work. Sorry, that was really derogatory. Sorry, that was really derogatory.
Can we give some big numbers? What's some big numbers we can have a giggle at? So, John, you're good with these. How fast are we expanding away from the centre of the beginning of everything?
I have no idea anymore because I've seen so many numbers. I thought originally when I first started looking into this that the galaxy itself was supposedly traveling at 1.3 million miles an hour, but I've heard 10 times that much. So I'm not sure. I'm sure that the sun is supposedly going somewhere around 500,000 miles an hour around the galactic center, supposedly making a 250 million year cycle. And that's a fact, right? Because scientists have been around for hundreds of millions of years to observe this cycle, of course.
Yeah, it's like the North Star. In 10,000 years, it will be a different one. Oh, of course, because any of us will be there to confirm.
When you talk parallax in 10 million years, it'll be there eventually.
Well, the funny thing is, though, is you've got the precession of the equinoxes, which is supposedly a cycle that is a 26,000 year cycle. However, that's supposedly caused by the Earth, in the heliocentric model, and here we are back to making fun of the globe heads. But the Earth supposedly maintains its rigidity in space in terms of tilt as it goes around the sun like this, around this plane, right? God, I sort of forgot what my point was.
Eventually, it rotates the precession. So
yeah, precession of the equinox. There you go. So, yeah. So the thing is that 26,000 year precession, even like a quarter of a degree would throw off the alignment with the North Pole star, because it's supposedly, I want to say, 483 trillion miles away, or 25. I don't know. It's some god awful number. It's some 25 light years. Something ridiculous. But at that distance, considering axial precession, if it was true, then we should have a new North Star very, very frequently. But we don't.
Yes. So when you ask about the numbers, Nathan, so we have the speed of the Milky Way galaxy away from the center of the Big Bang. That's speed number 1. How fast it's moving away from that point. Speed number 2. How fast, whilst it's moving away, it's rotating. Speed number 3. How fast, within all of that, the solar system is rotating, which is part of the speed that the galaxy is spinning, but not the same speed. It's not exactly the same. And then the Earth around it. And all of these things, really, is just, if somebody was telling you this as a story, you wouldn't buy it for a minute. You say no. Which is why we had it taught as kids, and later with the foundations of the globe, we had other things taught as we went through school.
Yep.
It wouldn't work. It wouldn't work if we were taught it now. In fact, I can see why they burnt so many people in the Inquisition, because people wouldn't have bought it. You know, so they burnt or drowned and hung, drawn, and quartered all the people that would cause problems and questions. And eventually, when the globe came along, everybody had a familial memory of the suffering that happened centuries earlier, because it went on for hundreds of years, the burning of people who caused trouble, the heretics. And the heretics were really people that communed directly with the Creator. They didn't need to go to a church. So, yeah, I can see why it happened, and I can see why the alarm. Oh, this is an interesting element, John. I've spoken with some of my colleagues, and when I bring to them something that really breaks the mold, the globe, they display fear, like literally fear. You know, the opening of the eyes and the hunching of the shoulders and the dropping of the chin. It's fear. What is this? Why fear? Why not wonder or mystery or fear? Literally fear.
To me, it was the opposite, because, like, I don't know, just throughout my life, I've had so many things that just didn't make sense, that I never got good answers for. I mean, we talked about one earlier, you know, with barometric pressure and gravity. I think we discussed that on the show, right?
Yeah.
Or was that before the show? So that was one. That was okay.
Mhm.
So there was that, and then I think when I was around 10 or 11, I took my first flight. I was confounded because the flight from Florida to Texas was the same in terms of duration as the return flight, which I thought was, you know, very bizarre and impossible if the Earth was spinning at the given rate. Then you've got the constellations remaining totally fixed, not changing at all over thousands of years. Never made any sense to me if we're supposedly, you know, going or, you know, flying in the galaxy 1,000,000 miles an hour, spinning around the galaxy, spinning around the sun. I mean, it just didn't make sense to me how we had predictable cycles at all in terms of eclipses, or even, you know, any sort of predictable cycle is just very bizarre in a heliocentric model. So to me, when I finally did look at flat Earth, and it took me a while to actually look at it, to me it was just more like eureka as opposed to fear, because it just, everything sort of clicked and made sense it just answers so many problems with a simple answer. And so I like stuff like that.
Yeah, I had when I stumbled onto the flat Earth, it was the biggest aha moment, you know, because I've been looking at the moon thinking there's something not right here for more than 20 years, thinking this doesn't fit. This shouldn't be here. This gibbous moon at midday should not be here. And then
I was
the
just
flat
thinking,
Earth
actually,
is
this
like,
may be part of the way we are programmed, or the way we're wired. If all the people that have had that inquisitive nature have been literally killed off, and the only people who have survived are the ones that have it done in secret, or they're looking at flat Earth or considering flat Earth without expressing it in any way publicly, because, like you said earlier, Antonio, they've got that in their blood. They remember that suffering. Well, if that's the case, you end up at a point where nobody's going to look at it, and you can bring in the ridicule so that it's kept down even more. But now we're at the tipping point where we are in an age where we are, at least on this panel again, happy to talk about it openly in public and face the ridicule and say, well, you can try and shame me all you like. As far as I'm concerned, it's obviously and observably flat, and I will stick by that, because nothing you can show me convinces me otherwise. So I'd like to reach a point where we are not ridiculing people who are believing in the globe still, if we phrase it that way. So it's past tense. It's dead, let's face it. The globe is no longer alive anymore.
You know, I
so
think we have to, though. I think we have to, and as much as this sounds, I don't know, it sounds bad, but I mean, first of all, it's the truth. The Earth isn't a spinning globe, so it's not like we're being deceitful here, or deceptive, I guess would be the right word. But yeah, it's almost like we.
That's
Well,
what we get labeled. as conspiracy theorists by saying it's flat rather than, like I've just said, it's obviously and observably flat. Well, you're a conspiracy theorist.
But that's
Well,
just classic
in order to be
ridicule.
effective, though, I think that we do have to ridicule the heliocentric model and their proponents, because that's how, I'm sorry to say, but that's how people feel comfortable with looking at a thing, is if people don't want to feel stupid. And so that's one of the biggest things that keeps people from looking at flat Earth. They've got a good thing going for them with that, because people think it's stupid, and they don't want people to, it's like, I don't want my mom or my brother to catch me looking at flat Earth stuff, so I'm not going to look at it. And then
I don't think that heliocentric entanglement is necessary for us. We can just look at it as being a bit benign. It's indifference rather than ridicule. Okay.
Yes, but in terms of a strategy or advancement, the reason they use ridicule is that they're afraid of it. So what John's saying, if we use ridicule, then they might, think, once they hear 7 or 8 people saying, "What, you think you're spinning on a globe?"
Exactly.
They might start thinking, "Oh God, actually, what?" And especially if you follow it with, "You think you're spinning on a globe? Why do you think that?" I learned to
I'm being a bit of a hypocrite, because earlier I was like, let's have a good laugh at their numbers.
Yeah. Well, no, but you're exactly, that's exactly right. But and again, to me, it sort of just comes naturally, because what I've tried to do since the beginning, when I put out my first flat Earth video, it wasn't something I had no choice, because I had come to this conclusion and I had to try to share it with people. Now, I found that you're never going to convince somebody of this. Never. No matter how well you present it, you're never going to convince somebody of this in a single day or a single sitting. Somebody has to really decide to look at this, and really they have to make a personal decision to scrutinize the globe model and compare that with a stationary plain Earth model. And
you saying that makes me feel so naive, because when I found this information out, it was such a eureka moment. I always used to describe it as holding a golden egg, and I thought that I would present this to people and they would light up with amazement and go, "Wow, thank you so much for giving me this information." How naive was I?
Well, I sort of felt the same way, because it was so obvious to me by the time I put out the first video that I figured, okay, I might do one more on this topic and that should be it, because it's just so obvious. But there's just all these little arguments that people cling to that you have to sort of go down the list and address, because people have been convinced that all these different things are exclusive proof to a spinning sphere, and it's like it's our job, or it doesn't pay well, but it's our job to sort of show that that's ridiculous. What their arguments are ridiculous. And
however, when you do, you reach a wall of cognitive dissonance. Ding.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. You do indeed. But I mean, if their model is ridiculous, then technically it's necessary to ridicule them, because they believe in a ridiculous hypothesis that has been, as far as I'm concerned, fully falsified.
Maybe that's where we should draw the line. Then it's not ridiculing them, it's ridiculing it, and it being the heliocentric model. If people want to believe in a religion and you see that as nonsensical, you wouldn't ridicule them, but you might, as a comedian, choose to ridicule the religion. But just persecuting the individual believer, I don't know if I agree with that.
Yeah, no, we can't. Because, I mean, just a year ago, almost to the day, well, no, it's been a year and 20 days. I put out my first video on May 1st last year, and I was a 2-week-old flat earther or so, something like that. But in a year, this thing has blown up, and I just, I see it going, hopefully, to new levels. And I see that happening. Like I mentioned in one of my recent videos, I'll just notice on YouTube, it's like not even flat Earth channels. People will just sort of in passing mention, the Earth is a stationary plane, by the way, just as if it's a known fact. So to me, that's very encouraging. I've just seen it in a couple of random videos that aren't, they're not flat Earth videos at all, but just people that are catching on to this and saying, hey, that's right, they're correct, check it out. And to me, I'll just keep making flat Earth videos until nobody else is arguing it, and then I'll feel like, okay, I'm done, right? But until then, it's pretty much the topic. It's the most important topic that we're faced with, right up there with the Federal Reserve or central world banks.
Yeah, I can see how actually some religions might themselves be against the flat Earth from their selfish corporate point of view, because it kind of demonstrates that there's a creator. You don't need to, really pay attention to what the priest is saying. You can let your heart guide you. The reason we all do this is that we know that if we weren't doing this, we would be unfair to ourselves. We would be treating ourselves unkindly, not allowing ourselves to basically help if we can.
Yes, good way.
We would feel unjust.
I feel compelled to do this. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, we would feel
compulsion.
we would feel unjust, like knowing that somebody's fallen in a well and not saying anything. That kind of thing. But with the other conspiracies around, like 9/11 and various other things, they're all important. But let's face it, the most important thing is the reality of where we live, the reality of what's going on, the mechanisms by which we've been lied to. Once those things are fully understood, we can then see how those same mechanisms were used to hide other truths. I'm wondering whether Armstrong, when he made that speech to the students, and he said something about the something when the youth of the world uncover one of life's hidden truths. It's like, what's he talking about? Is this what he was talking about? When the youth of the world uncover one of life's hidden truths. Yeah, could be that the world is flat and that there is a consciousness that's eternal and much more capable than we know.
Maybe that's a nice extrapolation of your where do you see this in 6 months, 12 months, 100 years question, which is that if we, again, regress back to the beginning of this conversation and we think about us questioning things as children, well, if there's I'm going to have to use the word, if there's a flat Earth movement or there's been a renaissance of this idea, then children will definitely pay attention to what is obvious and observable. And often in the face of what people will tell them, you have to really beat it into them with a long period of education in order for them to accept this programming. And you have to subliminally subject them to it, as we said at the beginning of the show, with cartoons and TV and music. So if we carry on banging this drum, and if the kids eventually hear about it, that's where things will turn at an exponential rate, simply because kids will go, yeah, that jives with what I see. I'm happy to accept the obvious nature of our reality, and critically look, more importantly, at what they're being told and say, well, that doesn't jive, but there's an alternative way of looking at things. That in days gone by when we were at school, the only utterance of flat Earth was in regards to ridiculing it and pictures of ships floating, falling off the edge. So we don't have that anymore. We now have access to this information, and the kids will access it.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny too, because the scientifical guys, the theoretical astrophysicists, or the lyrical hyperbolists, I like to call them,
the purveyors of scientism.
They're really grasping at straws, because like last August I did a debate, and one of the arguments was, of course, there's never been any sort of proof or evidence for gravity waves, and of course the answer to that is, well, within the next 5 years we'll have telescopes that are sensitive enough to sense gravity waves. And then of course last month LIGO detects gravity waves 1.3 billion years ago. So 1.3 billion light years away, they detected gravity
That's a big
waves.
number.
Yeah, that's a big number. But the thing that doesn't make any sense. I mean, the sun supposedly keeps this planet in orbit around itself. We can't detect that gravity, but we can detect two black holes from 1.3 billion years ago.
Yes, whose waves? Yeah, and those waves have been traveling through countless gravity waves, moving in different directions from different bodies. You know, somehow it's still something that they can decipher. Yeah.
But isn't it convenient though that now that and the way that they put it, it's so funny because they based on and this is sort of paraphrasing, but here's the data is over time the frequency went up. That's what they detected at LIGO. So over time the frequency went up. That's actually quoting what they said at their little speech. So that's the data that they're interpreting. So what they did is they made a very beautiful CGI animation of two black holes, converging into one singularity, but it's all based on a blip on a chart. And they convinced themselves that they had discovered gravity waves. And it's just it's just ridiculous. But so now now theoretical astrophysicists can say, "Ha, see, gravity has been proven now." I mean, isn't that just so convenient? I mean, to me, it's just too damn convenient.
Seems like a
There's also
reaction
another
to
element. Sorry,
you're going to talk about the observer effect, Antonio.
No. I was going to talk about black holes. The whole thing about black holes is that their gravity pulls in at such a level of magnitude that not even light can exit. So if they're pulling so hard,
the event horizon.
Say again.
That's only beyond the event horizon.
Yes. So if they're pulling so hard that they can pull photons traveling at the speed of light, and those photons can't escape, if that's how much they're pulling in, there's no chance that a gravity wave could pull itself away from them in order to reach us. That doesn't compute. And if what they're saying is this black holes somehow converged and created like a bubble effect of gravity, that also doesn't compute. I've read Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, where he's deliberating whether or not information falls in but data doesn't, or whether data falls in but information comes out like radiation. There's all kinds of nonsense there. But the idea that something that sucks in can send gravity out is a nonsense. And they've just kind of glanced over that, just skipped that. Notice that I've not heard Stephen Hawking or the avatar for Stephen Hawking talking about this. It's because it's a nonsense.
Well,
gravity on. If we can have a vacuum on the outside of our atmosphere, then I'm sure they can explain that away without any difficulty, Antonio.
Well, the other issue I had with it is, they theorize that the center of our galaxy is a supermassive black hole, and I have a big problem with a black hole traveling at, say, 1.3 million miles an hour. Because how can something that's pushing in on itself in all directions, right? Basically, that's what it is. Everything's collapsed in on itself. You've got this dynamic tension. How can that move at all? I mean, I don't even see how that could possibly travel. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me.
I've got a bit of a guess. Could it have something to do with gravity?
Yeah, there you go. Gravity.
It's because it's falling. It's falling, that's why.
That's it, you see? You got there. No problem. Easy when you know how.
Yes.
On that note, I think we might round out. Have you guys got any final thoughts before we round out the show and thank the viewers for being here?
I have one final thought, and it's when engaging with globalists. When you engage with cognitive dissonance, bear in mind that cognitive dissonance is a manifestation of suffering. The mind is not finding a pattern So it's feeling in danger, in alarm, which is the cognitive dissonance. So I think it's better, although we can ridicule the whole idea of the globe, I think it's kinder and more fruitful overall to have compassion on the mind of the globalist who's going through cognitive dissonance, because you can't get any information in, that's for sure. You can't have any introspection in that mind. All that they can observe is a void, a lack of meshing of gears, and it's an element of compassion when they go through cognitive dissonance to snap them out of it by diverting into a drink or something, to help them not go through that cognitive dissonance, because every time they go through cognitive dissonance with the flat earth, they will go into it deeper each time, because they will start to find that the minute the subject comes up, they have a pattern already of cognitive dissonance, but the new pattern doesn't mesh. So that's an extra layer of cognitive dissonance. Do you know what I mean? The new argument, is just scrambling the gears even more. So I think
we could
ridicule.
Another half an hour on cognitive therapy. I know we chatted about this with Patricia Steer. Maybe there's a whole other show there. I'm certain of it.
Yeah, but all I'm saying is, when talking with globalists, bear in mind that when they display cognitive dissonance, they are suffering, and that's a human being that's suffering. They're suffering because of the spell that they're under. So if you can find a different way of breaking the spell, then great.
Super.
Yeah.
You got any final thoughts before we round out?
I would just thank you for having me on your show. It was awesome to hang out with you guys, and I just want to thank all of the live viewers for hanging out with us. And I've got a couple projects in the works, so just be on the lookout for some new stuff. That's on the Morgile and the Morgile 2 and Jonathan Christopoulos. So there's my little shameless plug, and I really thank you so much. It's been awesome hanging out with you guys, and I'm sure we'll do it again soon sometime.
Yeah, we will.
Shameless.
Great.
I was going to ask you for a plug of all your channels anyway, so not shameless in the slightest. But yes, Jonathan Christopoulos, thank you ever so much for being on Mechanics of the Fourth Wall, and also Antonio. God, get something in there, Antonio. I was paused because I knew you were going to say something. Total silence.
Silence. I couldn't keep it. I couldn't hold it. Okay, there you go.
Super. So yes, to all of you who have joined us in chat, thank you ever so much for being here. I've been Nathan Oakley, and I will see you all in the next video.